Now, we've discussed this with High Representative Josep Borrell and the defence ministers of the 27, and we've come up with a 3-point plan. So the first point is that we continue freeing up ammunition stocks in the member states, and in order to do that, we are mobilising €1 billion from the peace facility. The second pillar is joint purchasing, worth €1 billion again from the peace facility. And then when we conclude these contracts, the defence industry has to be able to meet this demand, so we have to ramp up our industrial production. Now, we know this, even though this is completely unrelated, we have learnt our lesson here. We've seen what happened during the COVID crisis. Just because you sign a contract with someone, it doesn't mean that industry can actually supply what you want. You have to help industry, especially when it comes to ramping up industrial capacity, and we need proper management of supply chains as well. So this is the general context, and here I have been speaking to all of the countries with the task force. So we have identified 11 European countries which had or have a defence industry which can produce 155 shells and the 152mm shells as well, which are the former Soviet format, which is a format which Ukraine is still using. So I decided to go and speak to people in all of these sites in order to assess their capacity. It's the first time that we've done that in the EU. I have been accompanied by the defence minister of the country in question. I was very well received. It's the first time we've had this very overall and clear picture of our general capacity, and I have looked at the situation and the plans which have been drawn up in order to ramp up production, and perhaps to challenge the plans, discuss things with the team, and also to understand what they need in order to ramp up capacity significantly and to speed up production of this ammunition together. And here we, of course, need an overall picture of how much we need to do in order to support this initiative at an EU level. So I visited 11 tomorrow. I'm going to Germany, and on Monday to Spain, and that will mean that I will have visited all the countries that have the capacity to meet these needs. So what are my main conclusions following these very important visits? First of all, and very significantly, in Europe we still have a real production capacity. It's there. Now, if you look back in history or what's happened, of course, you see a history of Europe and what has happened. In the East, you had many factories where activity has been greatly reduced, but these factories are still operational. But of course, when you're talking about this, you need precaution. You need to take certain precautions. You need investment. We have specialized personnel. This is very heavy infrastructure to set up, but it's there. And if I can say so, this really is something which is very much a trump in our favour. What we need to do now is to bring up capacity. Again, it has been reduced, but in almost all cases, these plants are still operational. And then my second point is, when we look at the capabilities we have, now we have the peace dividend. Of course, there was a significant decrease in capacity, in needs. So what I needed to do was to see what has to be done in order to ramp up production, what kind of investment, what kind of human resources, because this is a highly specific work, of course. And then the third lesson I've learned is that industry, they all understand the need to ramp up production, But when it comes to the timing, it's not aligned with our immediate needs, and that's why we needed to give them a boost and to change the paradigm here. And my question was, what can we do to help them change the paradigm? Because the European defence industry has to see how we can move into this war economy mode, and they're not ready for that yet. So the will is there, but they're not ready yet in practice. So once again, we have to see what has to be done, and also to look at the whole question of ramping up the supply chain for very sensitive issues such as explosives, gunpowder and other equipment and machinery which will be needed for production. So this is a progress report. I think that within 12 months' time, with support, we will be able to ramp up our production capacity to 1 million shells per year in Europe. Of course, in the meanwhile, we have to continue freeing up our stocks, and we have to prioritize production towards requirements in Ukraine. So on the basis of the lessons learnt, what I've seen, we are proposing this act to support the production of ammunition, the ASAP. This is based on 2 pillars. One pillar, which I could call a programming pillar, and a regulatory pillar as well. On the programming pillar, we're talking about creating a support program worth 500 million euros to increase ammunition production in Europe. So once again, here what we're talking about is providing direct supply to industrial projects in order to ramp up our industrial base in Europe for the finished products and for the supply chains as well. That's very important. As I said, we're talking about expanding existing production, modernizing production, and perhaps creating new production lines and new factories within plants which are already there. And also reconversion of old ammunition plants which can be adapted to current standards. We're talking about co-financing to the tune of 40% from the EU and 60% from member states and businesses, with a possibility of a 10% bonus where there are partnerships. I'm always encouraging businesses to create joint ventures, to work together with others, to actually build up a real European platform, an interconnected platform, and there could be an additional 10% bonus for those who prioritize, who focus their production on Europe. Now, basically, that means 1 billion worth of investment, which we think is perfectly adequate because the factories are already there, the premises are there. It's just a question of ramping up the production and the work done in the factories. So cohesion, funds for cohesion and RRF for these plans, and also channeling resources into access to financing for the defence industry. This is very important, and I've made my point. Everybody must be involved. Everyone must take part in this effort. It's very important for Ukraine and for us as well. That's why we have these subsidies. We have a peace facility as well for our defence industry. That's on the programming side of things. That's a programming pillar. Regulatory side, now there are a number of regulatory barriers or obstacles. Authorizations, permitting, that would be done on a temporary basis, working time, public procurement and transfers within the internal market for shells, and the transfer of competences and skills. We also introduce certain measures for priority order. This is something which I referred to just now. We have to be able to channel production towards needs in Ukraine, and we will encourage companies to do this. And any compulsory measures would, of course, be a last resort. So, ASAP is there in order to support our defence industry so that they can meet Ukraine's requirements, but in the longer term also to meet the new security challenges we are facing in Europe. Now, all member states are involved now, and they'll be increasing their defence expenditure, and I'm encouraging them to increase their production to at least 1% of GDP. So, of course, we have undertaken to provide them with assistance so we can adapt to the new geopolitical situation, which will be with us for some time. And in conclusion, I want to work with the co-legislators so we can adopt this new proposal along with EDERPA by the end of June. This is, of course, something we have to do urgently. Now, we talked about this in the college this morning. We really do need to work very quickly when it comes to the adoption and implementation of this proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now take your questions. Heidi, please.
Merci Eric, din cercadul la televiziune publique grecque, agence de presse.
This is the Greek Press Agency. Commissioner, I'd like to ask you, what will the role of Member States be in the Commission's plan?
J'étais en Grèce.
Well, I was in Greece last week, last Friday, and I visited the infrastructure there, which is already quite sizable. In Athens itself for one of them, and in the region of Athens for another one, a factory where the risks are limited. The one outside Athens is Seveso rated, where they fill up the shells and ammunition. So the infrastructure exists. The needs is something I've much discussed with the defence minister who accompanied me throughout that visit, him and his teams. And there's a need to get these infrastructure back into shape. In one of them, this thing stopped in 2016, the other one in 2019. So they need to get back into preparation for production. And we're talking about the profits. Well, as I was saying a moment ago, the way we're approaching this is to say that there's a war. There's a war in Europe. And we don't yet know what the outcome of that war will be. So we have to make a commitment to all that we can to answer Ukraine's needs. And that's what we're talking about today. The Ukrainians very much need ammunition. Now, having said all of that, there are some countries who already have capacity. In fact, all the countries I spoke to answered positively. And we can see they do want to work together in defence with the European Defence Plan. This is now very much agreed upon. And this idea now has to pass across to industry. And I think that this will does now exist for everybody to work together. Obviously, for many of these companies, this means that local activity will increase. There's supply chains, subcontracting chains need to be put into place. And also in terms of employment, we talked about this a lot. There are skills required. Skills have to be mobilized. There's training issues involved. So beyond just expressing the will to make a contribution and to show solidarity altogether with Ukraine, and we also have to respond to the need for our collective security. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. We have to protect our own borders at some point. If we add the 2,000 kilometers of border that Ukraine has with Russia and the 1,000 kilometers of border that we have with Russia, that makes over 4,000 kilometers altogether we have with our neighbour. So behind all of this, we want to work together. And that's what I wanted to say about the impact of what we're doing, in particular in Greece. And I think the same goes for nearly all the countries I visited.
Josef Erk from Estonian Public Broadcasting.
Thank you for the floor. From the Baltic perspective, I have to ask, 5 million for 2 years is nice to have, but we know the Russian ambition, historical ambition. So don't you think that our ambition in order to produce ammunition should be much bigger for the years and decades to come? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's not 5 million, it's 500 million, so which is a little bit different. And by the way, it's not 500 million. It is at least 1 billion, because I said that it was co-financing. So we are talking about 1 billion capacity to upscale our industrial base. And I should tell you that with this, I am confident that while doing so, with the state-of-the-art of our defense industry that I have been, let's say, investigating and monitoring myself over the past 3 weeks, I'm confident that we could be able to upscale our industrial base to be able to produce at least 1 million ammunition in Europe for Ukraine. So that's, again, something that we can do and that we will do. And that's, I said, at least, because when I see the programs or the plans that every single entity has now, usually, I should say that before I came, the timeline was maybe 2 years or 3 years. And now my mission was to see how we can do to reduce this to 12 months, even if we keep their own program still continue to go on. So I said that with this, I'm confident that we'll be able to have a very significant base. And by the way, if it's needed, we could continue to increase. What is extremely important, again, is that we have these facilities in Europe. And by the way, I cannot give figures, but I think we have a larger base than the one, for example, our allies, the US, have today. Because, of course, also of our past and legacy. And because we have been able to keep this facility up and running for most of the case, even, again, as I said, at a lower capacity. So, in a nutshell, yes, I think it will be enough. And again, we will see what happens. But let's deliver first what Ukraine needs immediately. Because, again, we know exactly what's happening on the ground. And that's why I'm pushing so much, together with Josep Borrell, to mobilize member states so that they will be comfortable giving their stocks immediately and at the same time comfortable that our industrial base will be able to refill what is necessary for their capacity within the next few months.
Alain.
Bonjour, Monsieur.
Good morning, Commissioner. From Swiss Public Radio. The question on the funding of all of this, if I've understood correctly, you are going to be dipping into the post-COVID framework in the cohesion funds to pay for this ramping up. I'd like to know how you justify that, how you justify it legally and politically, because in theory, those funds aren't designed to produce ammunition. Is that possible? Am I being too conservative in my surprise, or are you being very inventive?
Si vous le permettez.
Well, first of all, if you allow me, you said you'll be dipping in to funds. Well, what the Commission will do is not dipping in, but making a proposal for funding, which was half of what was already identified for EDIAPA. As you know, that wasn't designed for procurement. So what we're doing here is using a part of that to support our industrial base. And the other 30%, some of it will come from the European Defence Fund, and we'll also be smoothing out the impact of that throughout the execution period, and we'll manage that well. That is the 500 million euros which will be made available. And then, as I was saying, we're going to have to act very quickly in terms of funding and allow the industrial sector to ramp up. And they need to invest over a longer period. Those who wish to do so in their own countries, they can, the member states can top up. It's not the Commission doing so. That's perhaps the point which was not clear before. Member states can access cohesion funds in certain areas. For example, in many of these factories, given the nature of their activity, they are built in places which are often very isolated. But they've been able to build around themselves a sort of a base of skills and employment which has been used in activities for decades. The activity decreased over the last few years, but we now have to help them to build back. And that's perhaps where they'll be able to use not huge amounts of money, but use the money from the cohesion funds, which are entirely appropriate and well suited to that activity. Now, once again, we're talking about a few projects compared to the 11 or 15 that I'm talking about, but believe me, most of the time, the ministers and prime ministers who accompanied me on my visits were well aware of their capacity to react, to boost sectors which were from an employment basis were lagging behind. On the second strand of this, which is the RFF side, the RFF was specifically designed for three main actions, I believe. First of this is the green transition. The second is the digital transformation. And the third of these is resilience. So, increasing industrial capacity in one-off actions here and there to support industrial projects, which will increase our resilience and boost our security, is clearly part of that. Thank you.
Merci, David Carretta, Radio.
Thank you, David Carretta from Italian Radio. Commissioner, on the 18th of May 2022, in this same very press room with Mr. Borrell and Madame Vestager, you presented a communication on defence, on building capacity, on the catching up that European and industry had to do, especially in terms of stocks of arms and weapons running down. You said that you were ready to invest 500 million euros to strengthen the defence industrial base. In July that year, you presented a draft regulation suggesting 500 million euros over 2 years. I would like to know why you are calling today's proposal ASAP, acting in support of ammunition production, or as soon as possible. What's happened over the last year? Why are we now was now so urgent? If the 500 million was available last year, are they still available now? I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing, Mr. Carretta. Let me be clear about what I'm talking about. What are we referring to? We are referring to, first of all, the war in Ukraine. And secondly, the requests made by the Ukrainian defense authorities and the needs which they clearly expressed. And the support that they requested. So we prepared a communication just before the Versailles summit. This was on the 18th of May. And this included the investment gap. Now, that was the background to all of this. Europe made this proposal, and EDIAPA is a regulation intended to support joint procurement, not necessarily the defence industry. And under EDIAPA, we couldn't directly intervene in the industrial area. And the first plan was about joint procurement, if you recall correctly. This defence fund was going to allow us to pool resources among at least 3 countries, 20%, 30%, including SMEs, to do research together. And then there was the procurement side of that, procuring weapons and equipment. This is about supporting the defence industry to support the effort required. I just wanted to make that clear, to restate that. We never talked back then about funding the defence industry. We talked about joint procurement. Please look at your notes. So what we've been doing now is funding this ramping up of our defence industry to make sure it's fit for purpose and to revise EDIAPA. Together with my commissioner colleagues, we've worked on an agreement. The Council found an agreement on EDIAPA, which is a separate subject. Let me be clear about that. Last December. And the Parliament a few days ago agreed to that. Now we're working together with the co-legislators to work on funding of EDIAPA by June. And on the funding, well, it's true that we could take 240 million from EDIAPA for ASAP. And this is because the peace facility for 1 billion for joint procurement is aimed towards the same objective. But I think that this is quite clear, and this is now today a new proposal compared to what we said last year, but follows very much on from the communication which was published at Versailles last year.
Bonjour.
Orly Pinet, you're active. Commissioner, you just talked about the Cohesion Fund, about jobs and growth. I do have a question, though. The industry is saying that they have problems in recruiting people. Is that something which came up during your trips around European defence industry? And how is your plan going to help us get over that obstacle? Are you going to change the rules to make people to work longer? All these factories will require people for the assembly, production, etc. I'd like to know what the situation is there. Well, first of all, we're not changing the employment rules. I'll take the questions in the order you put them, really. The first point is skills, and you're quite right. This activity requires a certain level of skills and specialities. Now, at all the sites I visited, I talked mainly about skills, because, as you're quite right to say, behind all of this are men and women who work in the factories and run all these machines. There are several levels of training. Not all activities require the same amount of training, obviously. There's training for some specific tasks. That doesn't take too long, but it's very important. Specific training for the arms industry. And then there are more specific tasks to do with pyrotechnics or technology. And what's important here is that there's a certain number of member states who've expressed their requirements, and they've come up with some plans to speed things up. We could use, for example, the European Social Fund to intervene to speed up training. We do have tools in our armoury for this. What I wanted to say, though, is that we've identified the problems. There are some solutions which are going to be put into place. We will support those. But there are also skills at the European level. in other areas. I was talking about vaccinations a moment ago, that we need to mobilise things and share skills from one member state to another. There are a lot of skills out there, member states, which aren't necessarily being used. So we decided to set up a sort of skills pool and set up partnerships with skills transfers to help us speed up in this transition period. So when we were talking about moving on to a war footing or war economy, we're trying to find solutions, thinking out of the box. Some of these industries very much worked in on a silo basis, didn't really see what was going on next door. So we will try to find solutions. We need to find solutions, and the solutions are there. The second comment I wanted to make was about some of the adaptations required, adjustments required. People are asking us, how many teams will there be? 1, 2, or 3? Depends really from member state to member state. Some said, well, we have legislation which prevented us, not everybody, about preventing work on weekends or at night, because in a specific case, on a temporary basis, we could find solutions to allow these production lines to work round the clock. That's what we need to be looking at on some of the very specific ideas. And as for everything else, as I was saying, the government partners who came with me on the visits will, I hope, find solutions on a member state basis.
Yes, thank you. Angela Mauro, HuffPost Italy. Do you think that this proposal can boost the French idea on Buy European related to the joint procurement? And did you gain more support on this Buy European plan in your tour? Thanks.
Well, again, the point, and you really, I think, understood it. The point is for us to make sure that we can increase the capacity of production of this ammunition, because, to be very honest, because of this war, because of the fact that this is a high-intensity war that probably no one forecasted, it's true that, how should I phrase it, we are lacking of this kind of munition to support Ukraine, but everywhere, not only in Europe, including our allies, the US, are lacking. Everyone is lacking. So that's why we thought together with Borrell it was extremely important to increase our capacity to enhance our production in Europe, because we have already this infrastructure. We have it. And then we will be able to answer probably faster than others. And that's why we are doing this. Now, regarding the eligibility rules, because this is the question probably you have in mind. They are clear. We take the supply chain as it is. So that's extremely important. Of course, we support European companies, but with all the supply chains. This way it will be simple, and I think it will avoid any kind of discussion. We want, of course, projects that produce in Europe. This is a requirement from the legal basis, but compared to other recent tools, for example, EDF or EDIRPA, we did not put any requirement on the supply chain. That's extremely important once again. So if, for example, the powder comes from outside of the EU, there is no issue. And then, of course, regarding EDIRPA, I am very confident that we'll reach an agreement soon, but this is another subject not under my direct responsibility.
Merci. Je passe à la plateforme Interact.
Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Nicolas on Interaction. You have the floor.
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez, je pense.
On t'entend, on te voit.
Bon, c'est parfait. Monsieur le commissaire...
Good afternoon, Commissioner. I would just like to go back to the question of the budget, in particular cohesion funds, which could be an interesting top-up. But the problem with the cohesion funds is that you need a certain amount of planning, it takes time, and it doesn't seem to be compatible with what you said about working quickly and the other sources of funding. So I was wondering whether you've envisaged an accelerated procedure of sorts for any businesses submitting a project for ASAP. Is there an accelerated procedure for the cohesion funds, and is there a one-stop shop so you don't have to submit the same file 3 times? Just that's an administrative issue. And then could you just confirm something for EDIRPA? If I've understood correctly, we're taking unused funding. We're not putting in any additional money. So there will only be 260 million left in EDIRPA, unless I'm mistaken, whereas the Parliament wanted to put more in. Now, are we talking about 260, or will there be more money? And then a more political question now, if I may, still on the budget. The defence industry is doing very well at the moment. They're making good profits. They're doing well. Is it actually necessary for European money to be used for an industry that doesn't seem to have any problems with funding? Well, on your first point, yes, there is a need for planning. Yes. Now, as I was saying, we're talking about relatively limited sums of money compared to the cohesion fund as a whole, for reasons I gave. Yes, we're going to open up this option. On EDIRPA, now, EDIRPA is there for joint procurement, and that's what we're doing with Pillar 2 of the proposal. And we buy things when we need to do something urgently. We need ammunition for member states and Ukraine, or let's say it in the opposite order, for Ukraine and for the member states. So the amount that we're putting in for joint procurement is not 500 million. There'd be 260 million left under EDIRPA, yes. We're talking about these procedures, but we have to look at it in terms of 1,260 million for joint procurement. Now, I'm not going to open up EDIRPA at the moment. We're focusing on the emergency situation we're in now. So it's very important to be able to meet these needs as quickly as possible. Now, on the third point you mentioned, access to financing. Well, what I see is that there are problems in gaining access to funding. It's not a homogeneous industry, first of all, the defence industry. We have many member states and businesses which could contribute. They're not all in the same boat financially, so we have to be able to mobilise what we already have. There's a defence industry in certain countries you're familiar with, but Europe isn't just one or two countries in terms of defence. Europe is Europe, and we have to see how everybody will be able to contribute. And my assessment of the situation is rather different when it comes to access to funding, and that's why we do need to come up with an instrument in order to intervene. Now, of course, we cannot have certain export contracts enjoying priority when it comes to immediate needs for Ukraine, and that's something else which has to be dealt with as well.
Thank you, Eric. Maria Psara with Efmerida των Συντακτών Greece. I have 2 questions. The first is, maybe I haven't get it right, but you said that you are confident that in 12 months, after your visit, in 12 months, the EU will be able to deliver to the Ukraine the ammunition needed. Could you please tell us from which country this specific ammunition that Ukraine is needed will be delivered? And the second question, I will dare to ask an unpopular question, I'm afraid. The EU has always been a union of peace, and of course, after the illegal war of Russia and Ukraine, this has the spirit, this pacifist spirit has changed. Is there any concern on this change of the narrative, although everybody should recognize the problems of the security in the EU? Thank you.
So for your first question, I think it's extremely important to listen to what I said. I said that, of course, after my visit and what we have put in place, I am confident that we will be able to upscale our production capacity in Europe within the next 12 months to produce at least 1 million of this ammunition per year. Now, there is a second, that's exactly what we are talking this morning about. Now, there is the second aspect, which is managed more than by my colleague Borrell, which is, of course, the track 1 and track 2 that we mentioned, in order to be able to deliver what is needed within these 12 months. And, of course, we mentioned the fact that we are encouraging member states to free their stocks. We can maybe refit some of old ammunitions. We have many other tracks. Of course, reprioritization is also something important. So we have many tracks in between to bridge the gaps. That's exactly what I said. So now, what I could tell you is that the 27 Minister of Defense has committed to that by taking again on their own stock, and it is their own job to do it. On the peace project, I mean, the security paradigm and architecture of the Union have, of course, we should say, dramatically changed. Since the Russian war of Ukraine, and we need to take this in consideration. It is a fact, and of course, this is when we say that we cannot be naive. This is not a fact, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we do whatever we can to continue to protect also together our fellow citizens, and then adapt ourselves to these new geopolitical realities. It's exactly what we are doing today.
Rosie.
Thank you very much. Rosie Burchard for DW. Can you give us some more details, please, Commissioner, on the priority rated orders? When will companies be obliged to prioritise orders? What happens if they don't comply? And more broadly, have you had any feedback from industry on this? We know in cases where you've talked about priority rated orders in the past with other industries, there's been complaints from businesses that it might jeopardise their business relationships with customers outside the EU. Thank you.
Well, first, of course, as I said, I'm always in favour myself. Maybe coming from when I'm coming. To prioritize, let's say, voluntary behavior. And I really think that every company and including in the defense industry, understand well, I could tell you this after my visit, my interaction with them, what is absolutely mandatory and critical for for the security of Ukraine and then also for our own security. So this is why first we have decided to incentivize the company who will do it. And of course I think it's important because sometimes, you know, we have some customers, they understand. Sometimes it could cost a little bit. So, I mean, it's fair to say that we could be here and understand their needs. Second, we will enter into dialogues with the member states where the industry is established, and we will not do anything without, of course, the consent of the member states. And third, priority orders are inserted into several acts already. I just remind you this. For example, the CHIP Act, which has been adopted a few weeks ago, the SME, and the Member State and the European Parliament agreed on a version of priority order for chips. So, of course, industry, I know they don't like it, but as I said, the priority is to deliver what we need to deliver for Ukraine, and also for our own security. So in case needed, we'll come with a decision through an implementing act, of course, together with a discussion with the member states.
I go back to the platform and I give the floor to Brooks.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, fine, thank you. I have two questions. Your proposal refers to derogations from the EU's two directives of 2009 on defense procurement and equipment transfers, neither of which have worked very well, by the way. So my question is, do those derogations refer to the EU's treaty that allows the member states to throw a national security blanket over their procurements to protect them from cross-border competition? Or do they refer to something else related to those two directives? And my second question, financing. Your proposal states that 40% of eligible costs could be covered. That seems clear. But it also says there could be 100% funding of eligible costs for other activities listed under Article 8.3.f. I read point F. It refers back to the other eligible activities, so it's not clear to me what projects will be eligible for 100% funding. If it's minor administrative costs, then my question is irrelevant. You don't need to answer it. But if you could clarify that, it would be appreciated. Thank you.
So, again, I just want to reiterate the fact that we are talking here of defense industry. And I want to be, again, very clear. This is what we are talking about. So, and not, again, acquisition per the EU of this ammunition. So, of course, you may have maybe some more technical answer to your question in the technical briefing, but I would like to tell you two things. First, of course, we allow that if a member state has already a contract, it can invite new member states to the contract without opening the procedure. And there is nothing on the national security clause. On the transfer, we ease the requirement for transferring spare parts between member states in a single market. That's the only thing that we do. And on financing, 40% of cost for the Union and 60% on member states. So our analysis is that it is totally compatible with the treaty. But of course, you will have maybe more detail if you want to the technical briefing.
Yeah, we'll come back bilaterally to you on that, Brooks. Yes.
Andrew Gray from Reuters. A couple of questions. First, Commissioner, on the 1 million shells target, can you clarify if that target is just for 155mm shells, or also 152, or also missiles? And can you tell us what's the starting point? I know there's some sensitivity around figures, but that target really only makes sense if we know where we're starting from. Those were my main questions. Thank you.
No, I'm afraid I cannot answer to your question, even if I have the figures, of course. But this is very sensitive information, and of course we have to be very careful to keep this information for us. What I could tell you is that, of course, it's not only 155. It is a lot of other ammunition. I mentioned 152, I mentioned 120, I mentioned 122, I mentioned missiles, anti-tanks, anti-aircraft, and this is all category, of course, of ammunition. That's what I could say. And of course, again, I will not give you the starting point. This is, of course, classified information. But again, as I said, with everything we put in place now, I'm confident that we'll be able to reach a capacity production of 1 million of all this equipment, all this, let's say, ammunition together within a year.
Okay, last question. So, yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Robert Ziegmund from the Austrian Broadcasting Commissioner. One question in terms of democratic legitimation. In Austria, we have now a party leading the polls who opposes more public money for sending ammunition to Ukraine. Now you're going even further. You're talking about the cohesion fund. How do you want to maintain the democratic legitimation for your plans in all the member states, given how far you reach right now?
Well, I mean, of course, I should say that everything we do since the beginning of this terrible war was not granted. I mean, it has been difficult to do, but we did it. Every step we took, we did it with the support of the 27 member states, together, collectively, and also of our European fellow citizens. But of course, it's funny because yesterday I was in Sweden. And I met the Prime Minister of Sweden. I met also some business leaders. And one of them told me, after all, what you are doing is a vaccine for our democracy. It was his words. And I think, yes, investing in our defense will allow us to defend our democracy. And this is what we need to say to our fellow citizens, and they're perfectly aware of that.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the college readout. Please stay with us. We will follow shortly with the next press conference on the anti-corruption package adopted today. Thank you very much.